The grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel shimmered like a jewel under the golden glow of 1,000 chandeliers. Guests in designer suits and glittering gowns floated across the marble floor, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of a live orchestra. Cameras flashed, champagne sparkled, and every corner whispered of wealth, elegance, and power. But amidst the sea of opulence, one woman stood apart, Elena Carter, her posture graceful, her emerald eyes calm yet distant. She wore a silver gown that shimmered like moonlight, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders in soft waves. Every eye that passed her way admired her poise, but few noticed the loneliness hidden behind her practiced smile. Across the room, her husband, Alexander King, commanded attention effortlessly. He was the type of man people instinctively noticed the moment he entered a room. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came from years of winning, not asking, Alexander was the CEO of a global investment empire. His voice carried easily over the hum of conversation as he shared a laugh with two foreign investors, his charm polished, his every gesture deliberate. To the world he was perfection, success incarnate. And Elena was the ornament that completed that perfection, beautiful, composed, and silent. It had been 6 years since their marriage, 6 years since she had traded her modest life as an art teacher for a place in his world of luxury and expectations. At first it had felt like a dream. The romantic dinners, the surprise trips to Paris, the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the universe. But somewhere between board meetings and business acquisitions, the tenderness had disappeared. Alexander had grown colder, more distant, consumed by the empire he was building. And Elena, once full of laughter and light, had learned to move quietly, never to interrupt, never to show need, never to step beyond the boundaries he had drawn around her. That night at the charity gala, the distance between them felt like an invisible wall of glass. Elena stood near the grand staircase, clutching her glass of champagne, though she had barely taken a sip. Her eyes drifted toward Alexander, who was surrounded by admirers and photographers. He looked at ease, his hand resting casually in his pocket, his tailored black suit impeccable. Every once in a while, his gaze swept across the room, but never in her direction. She had grown used to that, being invisible even in a crowd. Elena's friend, a fellow socialite named Clara Wells, approached her with a sympathetic smile. "You look beautiful tonight, Lena. That dress is stunning." "Thank you," Elena replied softly, forcing a smile. "You know, I haven't seen you and Alex dance in ages. You should pull him away from those sharks for once," Clara teased, unaware of how sharp her words felt. Elena only gave a faint laugh, one that didn't reach her eyes. Dance with him? She couldn't remember the last time he had even looked at her long enough to notice if she was standing beside him. And yet, despite everything, she still hoped, foolishly, quietly, that maybe tonight he would. Moments later, Alexander approached her, his expression smooth but his tone clipped. "Elena, the Vanderbergs are here. They'd like to meet you. Remember, speak little, and please don't bring up your art foundation tonight. This is not the time." His words struck her like a reprimand, but she only nodded. "Of course." As they walked toward the couple, Elena instinctively reached out to rest her hand lightly on Alexander's arm, a small human gesture. The reaction was immediate. He froze, glancing down at her hand as if it were an intrusion. His voice dropped to a whisper, low and cutting. "Don't touch me in public." The words were quiet enough for no one else to hear, but sharp enough to slice through her composure. Elena's hand fell away instantly, her pulse thundering in her ears. For a moment she stood there, her face frozen in a polite smile, while inside something small and fragile cracked. The rest of the evening blurred into a haze. She smiled where she was supposed to, nodded when spoken to, and laughed politely at jokes she didn't hear. But her heart felt heavy, heavier than it had ever been. When they finally returned home, their mansion, vast, immaculate, and cold, greeted her with silence. Alexander retreated straight to his study as usual, not bothering to say goodnight. Elena climbed the grand staircase slowly, her heels clicking against the marble. In her dressing room, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. The flawless makeup, the glittering earrings, the gown that caught the light like silver water. It was everything she had once dreamed of, yet she had never felt emptier. She sat there for a long time, remembering the woman she used to be, the one who painted at sunrise, who laughed until her stomach hurt, who believed love meant freedom, not control. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying his words again and again. Don't touch me in public, as if her affection was an embarrassment. As if her love had no place in his perfect, curated world. She turned her face toward the window where the moonlight spilled across the bed and made a silent promise to herself. She would not live the rest of her life unseen. The following morning, while Alexander left early for a board meeting, Elena sat by the breakfast table, untouched food before her. The housekeeper moved quietly around her, and the silence felt suffocating. Then suddenly she stood up, walked to her room, and opened the large mahogany closet. From its corner she pulled out a suitcase, a gift from Alexander on their honeymoon that had never been used since. She began to pack. Not everything, just enough. Enough to leave. She packed her paintbrushes, a few favorite clothes, and a photo of her parents. Then she wrote a short letter. Calm, composed, deliberate. I have loved you deeply, Alexander, but I cannot love someone who refuses to see me. I am not leaving to hurt you, but to find myself again. Elena. She placed the note on his desk and walked out of the house without looking back. The morning air was cool and filled with the scent of rain. She called a cab and asked the driver to take her to the old part of town, where the buildings were smaller, the streets quieter, and life moved at a human pace. For the first time in years, she breathed freely. Elena rented a small apartment above a local bookstore. The rent was modest, the walls a little faded, but sunlight poured through the windows every morning. She bought a canvas, brushes, and paints from a second-hand shop and began to create again, her first painting in nearly 6 years. It was a picture of a woman standing on a cliffside, her dress flowing in the wind, the horizon wide open before her. When she finished, she sat back and cried, not out of sadness, but release. Days turned into weeks, and Elena found herself rediscovering joy in the small things, the smell of coffee brewing, the laughter of children in the street below, the rough texture of canvas beneath her fingers. She began volunteering at an art therapy center for children, where she met Noah Hale, a gentle, optimistic counselor who believed deeply in the healing power of creativity. He admired Elena's quiet strength, though she didn't see it in herself yet. Noah often encouraged her to exhibit her paintings again, but she always smiled and shook her head. Maybe one day, she'd say softly. He didn't push. He just kept reminding her, you have something beautiful to share, Elena. Don't hide it. Meanwhile, in his penthouse office overlooking the city, Alexander King sat at his desk, staring at the letter she had left behind. It had been 3 months since she walked away. He had read the note 100 times, and every time it cut deeper. He had expected her to come back, as she always had before. But this time she hadn't. The silence was deafening. He found himself noticing her absence in the smallest things. The untouched corner of the bed, the missing laughter that used to fill the halls, the way the house felt colder despite the heat on full. He told himself he was angry, that she had abandoned him. But beneath the anger was something else he couldn't name, a hollowness he had never known before. He tried to bury himself in work, to fill the void with meetings and numbers and deals, but none of it satisfied him. For the first time, success tasted like dust. Then, one evening, while attending an investor's event downtown, he saw her. Across the room, standing beside a display of children's artwork, was Elena. She was laughing with a man, Noah, who was helping her adjust one of the framed paintings on the wall. She looked radiant, her eyes bright, her smile real. Gone was the tension in her shoulders, the guarded look in her eyes. She looked free, beautifully, painfully free. Alexander froze. His chest tightened as jealousy, regret, and longing all collided within him. For years he had demanded control over everything, his business, his image, his marriage. But seeing her like that, alive in a way she never was with him, made something inside him unravel. He wanted to cross the room, to take her hand, to say everything he had never said, but he couldn't move. For the first time in his life, the man who had everything realized he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. As Elena and Noah walked out together, their laughter echoing softly, Alexander's jaw clenched. The man who once told her, "Never touch me in public," now found himself struggling to breathe at the sight of her smiling beside another man. The control he prided himself on was slipping, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. the ache of a heart that had finally woken up too late. And in that moment, Alexander King, the man the world envied, knew that all his wealth and power meant nothing if he couldn't win back the woman who had once loved him enough to stay invisible, but who had finally learned to be seen. The city was alive that night, its skyline glowing with threads of gold and silver, as if every window held a different story. But in the corner office of King Global Holdings, the atmosphere was anything but bright. Alexander sat alone at his desk, his tie loosened, the remains of a half-drunk scotch beside his laptop. The glow of the computer screen reflected off his tired eyes, illuminating the unread emails, the unopened reports, and the calendar appointments he had ignored all day. For the first time in years, work no longer brought him comfort. The empire he had built, brick by brick with ruthless precision, now felt meaningless without the soft voice that used to greet him when he returned home. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the city below. From this height, everything looked small. The cars, the people, the lights. He had spent so much of his life chasing the view from the top. But now that he was here, he couldn't ignore how lonely it was. The silence of the office seemed to echo with the words that had driven her away. "Don't touch me in public." How many times had he dismissed her warmth as a distraction? How many moments of love had he traded for control? The memory of seeing Elena with that man, Noah if he remembered correctly, and burned like fire behind his ribs. She had been laughing, radiant, alive in a way he had never seen before, and the man beside her wasn't wealthy or famous. He was just present. The thought haunted Alexander. He didn't understand how something so simple could feel like such a threat. That night, for the first time in years, Alexander didn't go home to the mansion. He drove aimlessly through the sleeping streets, passing places that used to hold meaning. The park where he had first confessed his love, the small restaurant where they had shared countless late dinners, the old gallery where she had once shown him her paintings, back when she still believed he cared enough to look. He had always been proud of his ability to control his emotions, but tonight, the walls he had built began to crumble. He pulled over by the river and sat there for hours, watching the water flow beneath the bridge, realizing how much of his life he had wasted pushing away the only person who ever offered him love without condition. The next morning, he did something no one in his company had ever seen him do. He canceled his meetings, shut down his laptop, and left the office. He drove straight to the art therapy center, whose name he had memorized from the event program. He wasn't sure what he would say or if she would even agree to see him, but he knew he had to try. When he arrived, the building looked nothing like the glass towers he was used to. It was small, painted in soft pastel colors with children's drawings covering the front windows. Inside, laughter filled the air, the sound of children learning, playing, healing. The smell of paint and crayons hung lightly in the room. He felt strangely out of place in his tailored suit among the bright murals and handmade crafts that decorated the walls. A young receptionist looked up and smiled politely. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm here to see Helena Carter," he said, his voice lower than usual, unsure. The woman hesitated. "She's in the art room with the kids right now." "I can let her know someone's here." "May I have your name?" He hesitated for a moment, his pride tugging at him. But he forced himself to answer honestly. "Alexander King." Her eyes widened slightly, though she said nothing. She simply nodded and walked down the hallway to fetch Elena. When Elena appeared a few minutes later, Alexander's breath caught. She looked different, softer yet stronger. Her hair was pulled back loosely, her apron splattered with bright paint, and there was a smudge of green on her cheek. But her eyes, those eyes that used to look at him with quiet devotion, now held calm distance. "Alexander," she said, her voice steady, "what are you doing here?" He took a slow breath, searching for words that had never come easily to him. "I saw you at the exhibition. I needed to talk to you." Her expression didn't change. "You've had 3 months to call, to write, to say anything. Why now?" He swallowed hard. "Because I thought you'd come back. I told myself you just needed time. But when I saw you, with him, I realized I'd already lost you." Elena's jaw tightened slightly. "You didn't lose me to anyone, Alexander. You lost me long before that night. To your silence, your pride, your indifference." She paused, her tone calm but firm. "Noah didn't take me from you. He just reminded me of who I used to be." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words pressing into him. For a moment he couldn't find anything to say. Then he whispered, "You look happy." "I am," she replied simply. For the first time in a long while, the honesty in her voice pierced him. He had come expecting anger, tears, maybe even the chance to apologize. But her peace hurt more than her pain ever could. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quietly, "but I need to. I was wrong about everything. I thought keeping distance meant control and control meant strength. But I see now it was weakness. I pushed you away because I didn't know how to love without fear of losing myself, and in doing that I lost the best part of my life." Elena's eyes softened slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "You can't undo years of silence with a confession, Alexander. I spent too long trying to fix what you never wanted to acknowledge was broken." He nodded again, his voice breaking. "I know. I just needed you to hear that I'm sorry. Not because I want you to come back, but because you deserved better than the man I was." There was a long silence between them. The sound of children laughing from the next room filled the space, and in that sound, something fragile stirred in both of them, a reminder of the world that still existed beyond their pain. Finally, Elena said softly, "You should go. The kids will be back from their break soon." He looked at her one last time, memorizing the calm on her face, the light that had returned to her eyes. Then, with a quiet nod, he turned and left. That night, Elena sat by her window long after the stars appeared, her thoughts tangled and heavy. She hadn't expected to see him again, and hearing his apology had stirred emotions she thought she had buried. She didn't hate Alexander, not anymore. Hatred had burned out long ago, leaving only a faint ache of what could have been. But forgiveness, she realized, was something she owed not to him but to herself. Meanwhile, Alexander returned to his penthouse, the silence heavier than ever. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his choices. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. Instead, he sat on the couch staring at the note she had left months ago, still framed on his desk, a reminder of the woman who had taught him the hardest lesson of all, that love could not be bought, commanded or controlled. Days passed, then weeks. But something inside Alexander had shifted. He began cutting down his work hours, spending his mornings walking through the park instead of taking early calls. He started volunteering quietly at a youth entrepreneurship program his company funded, wanting to connect with people again. Not as the CEO, but as a man who had finally realized what it meant to care. His employees noticed the change. His tone was softer, his patience greater. For once, Alexander King wasn't leading from pride, but from humility. One evening, while visiting a local community event sponsored by his foundation, he saw a familiar set of paintings displayed in the hall, Elena's work. They were breathtaking, vibrant colors, deep emotion, hope blooming through pain. The title of the exhibit read, "Becoming Visible." He stood there for a long time, staring at the brushstrokes, feeling the story of her healing unfold before his eyes. Elena was there too, speaking with guests, her energy calm and confident. When their eyes met across the room, there was no shock, no bitterness, and just quiet understanding. She approached him slowly, and he greeted her with a soft nod. "Your work is extraordinary," he said, meaning every word. "Thank you," she replied gently. "I wanted to create something that reminded people they're more than their pain." He smiled faintly. "You succeeded." For a moment they stood in silence, the noise of the crowd fading around them. Then Elena spoke again. "You've changed, Alexander." He looked down, then back at her. "I'm trying to. It's not easy, but for once I'm not doing it to prove anything. I'm doing it because I don't want to go through life untouched. Not by love, not by kindness, not by people." There was a long pause, and then Elena said something that would stay with him forever. "Maybe that's what it takes for people like us, to lose everything we thought mattered before we understand what truly does." Alexander nodded slowly, his eyes glistening under the lights. "I used to believe love was weakness. Now I know it's the only thing that ever made me strong." When they parted that evening, there were no promises, no expectations, only peace. She walked away into the crowd, and for the first time he let her go without fear, knowing that loving her meant wishing her happiness even if it wasn't with him. That night, Alexander stood by his window again, looking out at the city. But it didn't feel cold anymore. Somewhere beneath those lights, the woman he had once silenced was shining brighter than ever, and that, he realized, was enough. What he didn't know was that Elena, standing on her balcony across town, was thinking of him too, not with pain but gratitude. Because sometimes the people who break us are also the ones who push us toward the strength we never knew we had. And though their paths had diverged, their stories were forever intertwined. Two hearts that had learned, in the hardest way possible, that love without respect is hollow, and that the courage to walk away is sometimes the greatest act of love of all. Months had passed since that evening at Elena's exhibition, and life had quietly rearranged itself around new rhythms neither of them had expected. Elena had found a steady balance between her art and her purpose. The Art Therapy Center was thriving. She had started new workshops for survivors of emotional neglect and trauma, and her gallery pieces were gaining recognition in the press. For once she felt grounded, living not in the shadow of anyone's expectations but in the light of her own rediscovered identity. She would wake early each morning, open her window to the fresh air, and feel gratitude for the peace she had fought so hard to earn. But sometimes when she least expected it, when she heard a familiar song or caught sight of a certain car on the street, her mind would drift to Alexander. She would remember the way his voice softened when he apologized, the way his eyes carried regret deeper than pride. She didn't miss the old version of him. She missed the idea of what they could have been if he had loved her differently. For Alexander, transformation had become a discipline, not a performance. Gone were the constant board meetings that once filled his calendar. He had appointed new directors to run parts of his empire so that he could focus on the parts of life he had ignored: charity, mentorship, and rediscovering what made him human. He spent weekends helping at community events, not for publicity but for connection. His employees no longer whispered about his temper. They now spoke about his calmness, his patience, his quiet smile. It was as though the man who had once built walls around himself was now learning how to build bridges instead. One rainy afternoon, Alexander sat in his penthouse reading a proposal from one of his foundation's projects, a partnership with several art therapy programs across the city. As he flipped through the pages, a familiar name caught his eye: the Healing Canvas Initiative, founded and directed by Elena Carter. For a long moment he just stared at it. Fate, it seemed, wasn't finished with them. The project aimed to expand access to art therapy in underserved communities, something he deeply believed in. His company's foundation could be a major sponsor, but a small human part of him hesitated. Would partnering with her reopen wounds, or would it allow them both to close the old chapter with grace? After several days of deliberation, he decided. He picked up the phone and called the number listed at the end of the proposal. A familiar voice answered. Calm, warm, professional. Elena Carter speaking. There was a brief pause before he said quietly, "Hello, Elena, it's Alexander." There was a silence on the other end, long enough for him to hear his own heartbeat. Then she replied, not with anger, but calm curiosity. "I wasn't expecting this call. I wasn't sure I'd make it," he admitted. "But I read your proposal. It's extraordinary. I think my foundation can help you bring it to life." Her tone softened slightly, though there was still a cautious distance. "That's generous, Alexander, but I don't want you to feel obligated. This isn't about us, I know," he said. "It's not. This is about something bigger. What you're building, it matters, and I want to be part of something that heals instead of breaks." She was silent again, but this time it wasn't cold. "All right," she finally said. "We can meet to discuss the details." They met 2 days later at a quiet cafe near the art center. The air smelled of coffee and rain, and the sound of raindrops tapping against the window filled the pauses between their words. When Elena walked in, Alexander stood automatically, an old reflex of respect he never used to show. She wore a simple cream sweater and carried a folder of documents, her confidence radiating effortlessly. He noticed how she moved, calm, self-assured, no longer shrinking to fit anyone's expectations. She sat down across from him, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Two people who had shared a love story too painful to forget, yet too meaningful to regret. "Thank you for meeting me," Alexander said sincerely. "I appreciate your interest in the project," she replied, her voice steady. "It's something close to my heart." As they began discussing logistics and plans, their conversation flowed naturally, surprisingly free of tension. Alexander listened, or really listened, asking thoughtful questions, respecting her insights, and never interrupting. Elena found herself noticing how different he seemed. The arrogance that once defined him was gone. In its place was quiet humility. When their meeting ended, she extended her hand. "I'll send over the finalized proposal next week." He shook her hand, his touch gentle, his gaze steady. "Thank you, Elena. This means more to me than you know, not just the project, but this chance to do something right." Over the following months, their paths began crossing frequently as they worked together on the initiative. What began as a professional collaboration slowly grew into a fragile friendship, one built on respect, maturity, and the unspoken understanding of shared history. They met with artists, donors, and volunteers. They visited community centers and schools together. The children loved Elena instantly, and Alexander often found himself standing in the background, watching her laughter fill the room, realizing that this was what real strength looked like, not dominance, but compassion. One evening after a long day of meetings, they found themselves walking through the city streets as dusk painted the skyline in shades of amber and blue. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and freshly lit streetlights. For a long time, they walked in silence until Alexander finally spoke. "You've changed everything, you know that?" Elena glanced at him, curious. "What do you mean?" "You've changed how I see success, how I see people, how I see myself." He paused, searching for the right words. "I used to think love was about power, about who needed who less. But now I understand it's about freedom." "You taught me that." She smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "We both learned something, I think. I used to believe that love meant saving someone, proving your worth through their transformation. But love isn't sacrifice, and it's choice. I stayed too long trying to be enough for you when I should have been enough for myself." He nodded, her words striking deep. "You were always enough. I just wasn't ready to see it." For a brief moment their eyes met, and the world around them seemed to fade into quiet stillness. There was no bitterness left, only a bittersweet acceptance that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't the ones that end in reunion, but in redemption. In the months that followed, their project became a huge success. The Healing Canvas initiative launched centers across the city, providing free therapy and creative programs for hundreds of children and adults. The press praised the collaboration between the once reclusive billionaire and the visionary artist, calling it a story of second chances. But to Alexander and Elena, it was something deeper. It was proof that pain could become purpose, and that broken people could still build beautiful things. At the grand opening of their newest center, Elena stood on stage addressing the crowd. Her speech was powerful, about healing, courage, and the art of letting go. Alexander stood in the audience listening, pride glistening in his eyes. When she finished, the crowd erupted in applause. For a moment, their eyes met again, not as lovers, not as strangers, but as two souls who had made peace with the past. After the event, Alexander found her standing by a mural painted by the children, a depiction of hands reaching for light. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "It is," she replied. "They painted it themselves. Every handprint tells a story." He looked at the mural, then at her. "Thank you, Elena, for letting me be part of this and for teaching me that even people who've made mistakes can still do something good." She smiled gently. "That's what growth is, and turning pain into purpose. We both did that." They stood there for a long moment side by side as the sun dipped below the horizon. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy, and it was peaceful. It carried understanding, closure, and a kind of love that didn't demand possession. Later that night, as Alexander drove home, he realized something profound. Not every love story ends with togetherness. Some end with peace, forgiveness, and the quiet knowledge that both people walked away stronger than before. And maybe, he thought, that was the kind of love that lasts forever, not in presence but in growth. Meanwhile, Elena sat in her art studio finishing a new painting. It was of two figures standing apart under a sky of golden light, their hands not touching but their shadows intertwined. At the bottom, she wrote the title, "When Letting Go Means Love." She smiled to herself, knowing deep down that every ending is also a beginning, and that the universe, in its mysterious wisdom, always brings people back not to rekindle what was lost, but to remind them of how far they've come. 3 years passed like chapters quietly turning in a book, Neither of them expected to still be writing. The Healing Canvas initiative had grown beyond what anyone had dreamed. What began as a small partnership between an artist and a businessman had become a nationwide program, transforming lives in dozens of communities. Elena had become a recognized name in the world of emotional healing and art therapy, invited to speak at conferences and universities around the world. She had learned to live fully, not as someone's wife or muse, but as a woman who had built her own meaning from ashes. And though her life was full, of color, of kindness, of purpose, there were still nights when she found herself looking at the city skyline and thinking of Alexander. Not with longing, not with pain, but with a quiet curiosity about how his story had unfolded after theirs diverged once again. Alexander, meanwhile, had continued walking the long road of self-reinvention. He had stepped down as CEO of King Global Holdings, a decision that had shocked the corporate world but felt like liberation to him. He now lived a simpler life, far from the towering glass buildings and endless board meetings. He had purchased a quiet estate on the outskirts of the city, a home surrounded by nature, where he spent his mornings reading, painting, and volunteering at local shelters. The man who once measured his worth in profit margins had found peace in silence, and though his name still carried weight in business circles, he no longer sought admiration. He sought meaning. He often thought of Elena, wondering if she ever thought of him too. He never reached out, believing some stories, once healed, were best left untouched. One spring afternoon, as Alexander walked through the garden he had planted himself, his phone buzzed with a call from one of his former directors. "Alexander, there's an event next week in the Global Humanitarian Summit. They're honoring your foundation and the Healing Canvas initiative for their contributions. Elena Carter will be there as a keynote speaker. The organizers would love for you to attend as well." For a long moment he said nothing. The idea of seeing her again after all these years stirred something deep within him. Not anxiety, but something closer to reverence. She had become a symbol in his life, a reminder of what love and loss could create when transformed into purpose. "All right," he said finally. "I'll be there." The day of the summit arrived under a soft golden sky. The event was held in a grand hall filled with people from around the world, philanthropists, artists, scientists, activists. The energy was warm, celebratory. Alexander walked in quietly, dressed in a simple dark suit blending into the crowd as much as a man of his stature could. He wasn't here for attention. He was here to listen. When Elena took the stage, a gentle hush fell over the audience. She looked radiant, poised, elegant, confident. Her hair was pinned neatly, her voice steady and melodic as she spoke about the power of compassion, about how art had the ability to heal where words could not. But then midway through her speech, her tone softened as she shared a story that caught Alexander completely off guard. "There was a time," she said, her gaze distant, "when I believed strength meant silence. I thought love was something to earn by being perfect. But I learned that real love, and the kind that changes you, begins when you stop trying to prove your worth and start living it." The Healing Canvas was born not just from passion, but from pain. And for that I will always be grateful, even to the person who once hurt me. Because in truth he taught me what healing really means. Her words settled in the air like light snowfall, quiet, profound, beautiful. Alexander felt his throat tighten, his chest heavy with emotion. She hadn't said his name, but every syllable carried the echo of their story. The audience applauded thunderously, moved by her sincerity, unaware of the deeper truth woven between her words. After the ceremony, Alexander waited until the crowd began to thin before approaching her. She was surrounded by well-wishers, photographers, and colleagues, but when she finally saw him across the room, her expression softened. Time seemed to fold between them, erasing the years that had passed. "Elena," he said, his voice calm but warm, "your speech was extraordinary." She smiled gently, her eyes reflecting both surprise and understanding. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't," he admitted, "but I'm glad I did. You've built something incredible. I'm proud of you. Thank you," she said softly, "and thank you for being part of where it all began." They walked together through the hall, away from the crowd, until they reached the balcony overlooking the city. The evening air was cool, the lights below shimmering like stars that had fallen to earth. For a while neither spoke. They simply stood there, Two souls bound not by romance but by the profound recognition of everything they had survived and become. "You look peaceful," Alexander said finally. "I am," she replied. "And you?" He smiled faintly. "More than I ever thought I could be. I used to think peace was found in control, in perfection. Now I know it's found in surrender, in accepting what is and forgiving what was." Elena nodded, her eyes glistening under the soft glow of the city lights. "It's strange, isn't it? How sometimes the people who break us are the ones who set us free." He looked at her, his voice low. "You set me free, Elena. You taught me how to feel, how to care, how to let go of the walls I built. I used to resent the space you left behind, but now I see it as the place where I finally learned to breathe." Tears welled faintly in her eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. "And you taught me that love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrendering yourself away. I had to lose you to find myself, Alexander. But I'll never forget what we were, not as a mistake, but as a beginning." They stood in silence again, the wind gently moving between them like the whisper of time itself. There was no bitterness, no regret, no longing for what could have been. Only peace, the kind that comes from closure that heals rather than wounds. When they finally turned to leave, Alexander said, "If you ever need help with the next phase of your program, funding, expansion, anything, my foundation is still here. No conditions, no strings," she smiled softly. "You've already given enough, Alexander. Sometimes support means stepping back and trusting others to carry it forward. You taught me that too." He chuckled quietly, admiring her strength. "Then I'll trust you, Elena. You always did know how to finish what we started." They parted that night under the soft glow of the streetlights, each walking in opposite directions, but neither felt that familiar ache of loss. Instead, they carried with them something far greater. The knowledge that they had turned their shared pain into something that changed lives, that they had found forgiveness where once there had only been silence. In the months that followed, life continued its quiet rhythm. Alexander's health began to wane, not dramatically, but in the subtle way time humbles even the strongest of men. He spent more time painting in his garden, capturing sunsets on canvas, finding beauty in impermanence. Elena, on the other hand, took her program global, traveling to countries where her work brought healing to thousands. Yet, every so often, when she passed through the city they had both once called home, she would visit the small park where they had first confessed their love. She would sit on the same bench, close her eyes, and smile, not in nostalgia but in peace, because in the end their story had never really been about loss or regret. It had been about evolution, two souls who met not to complete each other but to awaken each other. And even though their paths had diverged, their journeys had always been moving toward the same truth, that real love isn't about forever, it's about transformation. And somewhere, beneath the fading light of another golden evening, Alexander King sat before his easel, painting two figures walking away from each other under a vast starlit sky. In his quiet home, surrounded by the stillness of everything he had learned, he titled the painting simply, "We Met to Become." He placed down his brush, smiled faintly, and whispered to the empty room, "Thank you, Elena." The legacy of what remains. 2 years had passed since that evening at the Global Humanitarian Summit, when Elena and Alexander met for the last time under the soft lights of the balcony. Time, as it always does, moved quietly but with purpose, reshaping their worlds in ways neither could have predicted. The Healing Canvas initiative had become a global movement, with chapters across continents, touching thousands of lives through the union of art and emotional restoration. Elena had become not only a respected leader but a symbol of resilience, a woman who turned pain into power and silence into a voice for healing. Her name appeared in magazines, on talk shows, and at international conferences, but she never let fame touch the purity of her purpose. Behind every speech and every award was the same intention that had guided her from the beginning, to help others rediscover the beauty of their own worth. And yet, despite her accomplishments, she often found herself drawn to quieter spaces, the kind that allowed her to feel small again, not in insignificance, but in humility. She rented a small countryside home outside the city, where the air was filled with the scent of wildflowers and the sound of distant church bells. There, between her travels, she would paint, not for exhibitions or publicity, but for herself. Her art had evolved into something freer, lighter, touched with peace. Each brushstroke carried gratitude for every tear, every heartbreak, every failure that had led her to where she stood now. One early autumn morning, while preparing for a trip to Geneva to speak at an international summit on emotional wellness, Elena received a letter. It was handwritten, sealed in an elegant cream-colored envelope with a familiar crest pressed into the wax. Her heart stilled for a moment before she opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, none Alexander's. "Dear Elena," it began. "If you are reading this, it means that time has done what it always promised to do, carry us forward even when we weren't ready. I write to you not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. These past years have been the most peaceful of my life. I have found joy in simplicity, in watching the sun rise over the hills, in tending to the garden where wildflowers grow without permission. I have painted again, not to impress, but to remember. You once told me that creation is a form of healing, and now I understand that truth more deeply than I ever did. But my health has begun to wane, and the doctors say my heart has only so many more seasons left. Don't be sad when you read that, Elena. I have lived enough for several lifetimes, and much of that is because of you. You helped me see the man I wanted to be, not the man I once was. I will always be thankful for that. There's a final piece I wish to show you, a painting that belongs to both of us. You'll find it waiting at my home should you ever wish to see it. Yours with peace, Alexander." The letter trembled slightly in her hands when she finished reading it, not from shock, but from the quiet weight of inevitability. She had known deep inside that one day their story would reach this kind of ending. Not a tragic one, but one written in acceptance. That night, after much reflection, she canceled her Geneva trip and booked a train ticket to the countryside where Alexander lived. The journey was long, the world outside shifting from busy cities to open fields, from concrete to green. When the taxi finally pulled up the gravel path to his home, Elena was struck by its serenity. The estate was modest now. No guards, no staff bustling about, just the quiet hum of life surrounded by trees and flowers in late bloom. She walked through the open gate, noticing a small wooden sign by the path that read, "Welcome, where hearts come to rest." A housekeeper greeted her kindly and led her through the house, explaining softly that Mr. King had been ill for several months and now spent most of his time resting. When Elena entered the study, she found him there, sitting in a sunlit chair by the window, a blanket draped over his lap and a sketchbook open before him. Though frailer than she remembered, his presence still carried that quiet strength that had once filled entire boardrooms. His hair had turned silver, his face gentler, his eyes bright with recognition as he looked up and smiled. "Elena," he said, his voice low but warm. "You came." "I did," she replied, her tone steady yet soft. "You invited me, didn't you?" He chuckled weakly. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I couldn't not," she said, taking a seat beside him. "You still have a way of pulling people toward unfinished stories." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that held both memory and peace. "I didn't bring you here for goodbye," he said slowly. "Goodbyes belong to people who still think time can separate them. I wanted you to see something." He pointed to a large canvas set on an easel nearby, still covered by a linen cloth. Elena rose, hesitated briefly, and then gently lifted the cover. Her breath caught. The painting was of two figures, a man and a woman standing on opposite sides of a wide river at dusk. Between them, the water shimmered with reflections of golden light, and though they could not cross, both were reaching toward the same horizon, their shadows merging on the water's surface. It was not a painting of separation. It was one of unity through distance, of love that had transcended the need for possession. At the bottom corner, written in small, careful script, were the words, "Where we end, we begin." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's ours," he said simply. "It's what we became. Two souls walking different paths but sharing the same sky." They spoke for hours after that. Not about the past, not about regrets, but about meaning, about the strange, wonderful way life finds ways to bring healing full circle. Alexander told her about his quiet days painting, his work with youth programs, his rediscovery of joy in ordinary things. Elena shared stories from her travels, children who had learned to express their pain through colors and shapes, communities that had found unity through art. Each story felt like an echo of the same truth, that even the deepest scars could bloom into something beautiful if treated with compassion. As dusk fell outside, the sky turning the color of old wine, Alexander leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed but his smile content. "Promise me something, Elena," he said. "Anything," she replied. "When they ask you years from now what this was between us, tell them it was real. Not perfect, not easy, but real. Tell them we didn't fail. We transformed." She reached for his hand, holding it gently, not out of pity but in reverence. "I promise," she said. He nodded faintly, a look of peace settling over his face. "Good, that's all I ever wanted to know." The silence that followed was sacred, not empty. When she left that night, she knew instinctively that it would be the last time she saw him in this life. And yet she didn't cry on the way home. Instead, she smiled through the ache, feeling an immense sense of gratitude that she had been given the chance to say everything that mattered. A month later, she received a call. Alexander King had passed away quietly in his sleep, surrounded by the soft light of morning and the scent of blooming jasmine from his garden. His will revealed that he had left his home to the Healing Canvas Foundation, along with all of his paintings, asking that they be displayed in a permanent gallery dedicated to emotional healing through art. The gallery would be called the House of Becoming. On the day of its opening, people from all over the world attended, philanthropists, artists, students, and everyday visitors who had been touched by their shared vision. Elena walked through the hall slowly, pausing before the final piece, the painting of the man and woman divided by the river. A small plaque beneath it bore an inscription written in Alexander's own words, "To the woman who taught me that love is not possession but transformation. May all who stand before this remember, healing is the most beautiful form of love." Elena stood before it for a long time, her reflection blending with the golden light on the canvas. Around her, the air was filled with quiet awe. She felt no grief, only profound peace. Love, she realized, does not end when life does. It continues in the lives it touches, in the art it inspires, in the kindness it leaves behind. As the years passed, the House of Becoming became a sanctuary for those seeking solace, a place where broken souls found fragments of themselves reflected in the colors and shapes Alexander had once painted with trembling hands. Elena continued to guide the foundation until her later years, carrying forward the legacy they had created together. And though she never married again, she was never alone, for love, once true, never really leaves. It changes form, becoming presence, becoming peace. On her final birthday, long after her hair had turned silver and her hands trembled slightly with age, she sat by the same riverside she had once painted in her youth. The sunset burned orange and gold across the horizon, and she whispered softly to the wind, "We did it, Alexander. We became." And somewhere beyond the veil of time and breath, she could almost hear his voice, be steady, calm, and warm, answering back, "Yes, we did." The light faded gently across the water, and the story that had once begun with distance, pride, and silence ended not with tragedy, but with peace. The kind of peace born only from love that has learned how to let go yet never truly ends.